Let's take a look at some charts on EOS for this week's article on Brave New Coin. So EOS is a bit of a scrapper down here amidst the LTC, the BNB, the Tezos, the Link, as well as on here it's not shown. But from a market cap perspective, which is what this is, it is nestled between a few other proof of stake players, an exchange token, and LTC, which doesn't really do much on its own from a staking or proof of work perspective. So EOS is certainly different than its neighbors in the market cap arena. EOS is a proof of stake network that uses block producers to confirm transactions, and it uses 21 of those. They actually get the reward, and then they distribute rewards to those who are staked under them. Now you can see first off the bat that most of these are in Asia. 9 of them are in China, so there's a bit of a centralization issue there. If you're pro proof of stake and anti proof of work, and your key thesis is that proof of stake helps increase decentralization and proof of work is centralized in China, well, you kind of lose that argument because even here, most of it's in China or Asia. Another big problem here is that many of these are exchanges themselves, so there's a bit of a conflict of interest from a governance perspective. Not necessarily currently, but down the road where there are issues that arise that are favorable to exchanges and not favorable to users of the network. So these exchanges can vote for governance issues that benefit them. Now users can always pull their EOS or votes away from these producers into somebody who agrees with their political governing decisions, but this is just something to consider. Again, it breaks the decentralization argument because if you're staking on exchanges or for exchanges, then the exchanges control the network. That's just how it is. You can see Huobi, Bitfinex, Nudex, OKEX is on here. WhaleX, I think, is an exchange as well. So these aren't just mom and pop places. These are exchanges. Now there's a big cost with running an EOS node. There's a big cost with running a full EOS node. I couldn't find any information on the size of a full EOS node or how difficult it is to sync the network. It's just not freely available. If anything, I need to talk to the Bitfinex people who just spun up a full node, because if you are on the top 21 list, you don't actually need a full node, apparently, which I think is a faux pas from a chain perspective. If these people are getting paid out in EOS to run the network, they should also be maintaining a full node. Full nodes are necessary for complete information on dApps that are run on the chain, for example. Looking at the GitHub for EOS, it's certainly down over the years, but it's not like inactive or anything, so nothing necessarily to worry about there. One thing that I always look at is, what is Dan Larimer doing on the EOS GitHub, and the answer is not much. So he's either under a pseudonym doing other stuff, or he's just not coding on EOS, or he's doing managerial decisions or something, I don't know. But they have a whole pile of people who work in Virginia and DC soon. So there's definitely money being thrown at EOS and it's being worked on. It's just not necessarily seen on the GitHub, this specific repo. Looking at the value, USD value in EOS that's being staked. So I think it's 62% of the network, I said in the article, that is being staked on EOS. Tezos is like 80 to 85% at times. So EOS is the second largest staked value compared to Tezos. Everything else is kind of much smaller than that. You can see Atom Dash, Tron, Nem, Algo. Some of the newer projects, some of the much older projects have very large staking footprints, but EOS is definitely one of the largest among them. Looking at transactions per day, which is the line here, and blocks produced per day, you can see that as blocks produced per day fell off dramatically because of scalability issues with one of the airdrops, transactions per day fell pretty dramatically. Now this is a feeless chain, so you can see transactions per day in the millions, and the question is always, does that even matter if transactions are free? Is a free transaction the same? Should it be considered the same as a transaction like on the Bitcoin network that costs, I don't know, 10 cents or less to send? It's a bit different and should be treated differently just because it costs money to send a transaction on Bitcoin, for example, or Ethereum. What this is good for is dApps that have multiple millions of transactions per week, that sort of thing. It's really valuable for those dApps where transactions are free. So there's definitely a time and a place for feeless transactions. It's just, can they scale? Do they have full node issues, which they do? Do they have syncing issues, which they do? So there's all sorts of ancillary things to consider when the chain is feeless. Does it have problems with airdrops and spam that clearly the network can't handle? Since that drop in blocks produced per day, blocks have perked back up again. So it wasn't like a long-term detrimental effect, but it was definitely felt earlier in the year and late into 2019 when transactions went from above 10 million to below 2 million per day. Looking at the top dApps by volume, I always sort by volume. You can sort by users or transactions per day, but I always like volume just to see who's pushing the most EOS on the chain. And no surprise, it's an exchange, Nudex, again, one of the block producers. Most of this other stuff is gambling. WhaleX, another block producer, an exchange here. But 15 million is quite the lion's share of dApps based on volume per week. You can see some rumblings of DeFi starting on EOS. I don't actually know this project Equilibrium, but I suspect if EOS will be successful in the future, that more and more DeFi projects will pop up on EOS, just like they have on ETH. It's actually cheaper to run a DeFi product on EOS. Again, the issues are just everything I already mentioned: scalability, network uptime, that sort of thing to consider if you're a DeFi project. So I suspect this gambling stuff is like version 1 of any dApp, just because it's easy to run up, easy to create, and you get a lot of buzz. People love to gamble. And eventually it moves to exchanges, and now it's moving to DeFi, derivatives, that sort of thing. Looking at the Google trends for EOS.io specifically, it's just been down sort of at multi-year lows now. I'll admit that the Google trends for EOS.io isn't like the best thing to look at for popularity of EOS. But the problem is you can't really look at EOS Google trends just because it's a common word that's not specific to crypto. So in general, this isn't a bullish picture. Certainly you want to see this rising, but it's not like there's been a lot of articles about EOS.io anyway, or a lot of people Googling EOS.io or what is EOS.io or that sort of thing in recent times that I can see. All right, let's look at technicals. We got long shorts on Bitfinex, yearly pivots, the horizontal lines here, the vertical or the horizontal bars here are VPVR, volume profile of the visible range, and RSI, which is an oscillator, looking at momentum. So you can see we have the 50 and the 200 as well, and they should cross bullish over the next week or two if price perks up. One issue I see with any bullish change on EOS in the near term is that there's a ton of upside volume resistance here. There's also yearly pivots to deal with, there's previous highs to deal with, and you can see in general it really hasn't moved on its own. I mean, it moved earlier than most things in March 2019 when it moved with EOS or with LTC before BTC did. It had its bull run with the rest of the market, it had its bear run with the rest of the market, bull run early 2020, March drop, just like everything else, and now it hasn't quite recovered as much as BTC and ETH have. So the EOS BTC chart, which I'll show in a few charts, it just looks devastatingly bad because it hasn't kept up with BTC. Now, EOS doesn't really have an exciting fundamental event like BTC does, so that's part of the reason. Just something to consider when looking at the BTC pairs. So I expect resistance at 385, at 4, 425, previous high here at 550, previous high here at 7. So there's tons and tons of resistance all the way up. It's just a matter of, is there enough buying volume to absorb what's going on here? I think the ICO price, so the average token price was 574. Now they had a year-long ICO, so there's a lot of other things to consider, but average price was 574. So if it can get above 574, that generally says that anybody who wants to sell at break even or less has got out, washed out of the market. So 574, 575, whatever, big level to watch on the way up as well. Long shorts on Bitfinex don't really say much, just that it's mostly longs here. So if this does drop and makes new lower lows, it's going to be pretty ugly as these longs begin to close their positions and push price lower. Looking at a pretty decent pitchfork, if I do say so myself, on EOS USD chart again, you can see that the trend channel here predicts a high and a low based on these diagonals. It also predicts the median line to be a magnet for price, so long as the trend channel holds. So you can see it tapped it on the way up a bunch of times, tapped it on the way down 5 or 6 times, and tapped it again on March 12th, pierced it pretty nicely here. It's once again flirting with a bullish break of the upper half of the downward bearish pitchfork. So you can see, despite being in the upper half here, it just hasn't really broken out strongly above the pitchfork on its own volition. It's had the voice announcement, the voice launch, which wasn't on the EOS chain, sort of perked up price, but it's never really had any price history above the pitchfork, long lasting anyway. So you want prices above 343 or higher, to say this bearish pitchfork is over. Otherwise, you're expecting, $1.25, whatever this is, eventually, or lower. Just as it hit all of these lows, despite hitting the top of the pitchfork. If it doesn't break out here, you'd expect it to return to the median line again. Looking at the cloud, if you've put in a range, a high and a low, and you don't make a higher high or a higher low, the cloud will print a 50% retrace target. So you can see, despite most of the market retracing to its 50%, EOS has not, and it's once again below the cloud. So it's definitely less bullish than a lot of these, like BTC and EOS. BTC, ETH, Tezos, Link, all these coins are above their cloud now, whereas EOS is struggling below the cloud. So definitely more bearish on a trend metrics perspective. And then looking at EOS BTC, the first thing you can see is just this multi-year low. Don't want to see that if you're bullish. Certainly trend metrics completely unfavorable. Over the past few months, below the cloud, below the 200, you can see it had this brief period above the 200 above the cloud, and then it's just been faded ever since. And now that it's below this big previous consolidation, big volume zone, that will be resistance on the way up, which is the highest volume on the chart. So it's probably going to take another reconsolidation in this zone, should it return, before it breaks up again. So this just doesn't look good from any perspective. Supports are around 23,000 sats, 14,000 sats, if it makes those lows. Resistance, 55,000 sats, 70,000 sats, any of these spikes in volume, this yearly pivot. But I don't expect this to perk up anytime soon. This does not look good when you compare it to anything. Doesn't look good on the USD chart, doesn't look good on the BTC chart. So it's going to need some fundamental something to turn this bus around, because right now EOS just doesn't look bullish from any perspective.